Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we follow a brilliant mind through a tangled puzzle, a silver mask, a hidden crime, and secrets buried in plain sight. Shadows whisper through the village, and one question lingers. Who can uncover the truth? Pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. The late afternoon sun hung lazily over the village of Little Whimsy, bathing the neatly trimmed hedgerows and the prim flower beds of Oakwood Manor in a honeyed light. The air carried a faint scent of lavender from the gardens and the ever-present hint of freshly baked scones from the kitchen. In the drawing-room, the silver-framed clock ticked evenly, marking the leisurely passage of time in a household accustomed to a certain genteel rhythm. It was the kind of day that promised nothing more extraordinary than polite conversation, warm tea, and the occasional ripple of gossip. A day that would have pleased even Miss Marple, had she been attending simply to enjoy the quiet. Yet Miss Marple, seated at the edge of the rose garden, was far from idle. Her small, observant eyes scanned the gathering assembled for Lady Rowena Telford's annual garden party, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the faint expressions of annoyance that flitted across otherwise smiling faces. The villagers, dressed in their Sunday best despite the fact that it was Wednesday, circulated in polite clusters, balancing delicate porcelain cups and plates upon silver trays with varying degrees of competence. It was a study in human behavior, and Miss Marple, as always, was taking careful mental notes. "Ah, Miss Marple," chirped a voice from behind. Lady Rowena herself, resplendent in pale blue silk and adorned with a string of pearls that caught the sunlight, descended the stone steps with the practiced grace of someone who had presided over many such gatherings. "Do join us. You are far too quiet for someone so keen on observing, I think." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Observing Lady Rowena is much easier from a comfortable corner," she said, gesturing at the wicker chair she occupied beneath the shade of a sprawling oak. She remained seated, her eyes flicking briefly to the younger guests who were laughing a little too loudly, as though determined to announce their presence. At the far end of the lawn, a small table had been laid out with trays of delicate sandwiches, crystal bowls of strawberries, and glasses of sherry that caught the light like little gems. The conversation among the guests was a gentle hum, punctuated by the occasional clink of fine china or a particularly enthusiastic exclamation at the sight of a prize-winning rose. But it was not long before that hum began to falter. Good heavens! Lady Rowena's voice rang out, sharp and disbelieving. A crowd of startled guests turned toward the fountain where the commotion had begun. There, sprawled awkwardly beside the ornate marble water feature, lay the figure of Mr. Alistair, Pritchard, the Manor's solicitor. A thin smear of blood stained his crisp white shirt near the collar, and his hand rested unnaturally at his side, fingers curled as though clutching at some unseen enemy. The garden fell into sudden, awkward silence. A few of the younger women gasped, their gloved hands flying to their mouths. The men, recovering from initial shock, bent over the prone figure, whispering anxiously among themselves. Miss Marple, however, remained where she was, a slight crease forming between her brows as she assessed the scene with quiet detachment. "Someone call the doctor," a voice finally demanded. The urgency in it sent a ripple of panic through the assembled crowd. But before anyone could move, Lady Rowena's sharp gaze swept over the lawn, landing firmly on the nearest guests. "No one is to leave. Please remain calm. We must wait for the authorities." Miss Marple's eyes, hidden behind the spectacles perched delicately on her nose, were alert. She noted the man clutching the silver tray, his knuckles white, the lady who had been chatting about her new bonnet suddenly pale and trembling, and the boy who had been feeding crumbs to a nearby robin, frozen mid-step with a guilty expression. Human behavior rarely faltered under stress, and yet there were subtle tells, nuances that revealed more than spoken words ever could. It was in these tiny, often overlooked movements that Miss Marple found the threads that would, in time, unravel the mystery. But for now, she allowed the villagers to assume the scene as it appeared a shocking accident, perhaps a fainting spell, perhaps something more sinister. She, however, had the sense that the day's simple pleasures had just been shattered by a far more complex disturbance. A murmur of voices rose, fragmented and anxious. The local constable, a stout man with a manner that was generally reassuring, arrived at the gate, prompted by the hastily dispatched maid. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, and he strode forward with brisk purpose. "Step back, everyone. Give the gentleman room. We need to ascertain what has occurred." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, the faintest smile tracing her lips. She did not yet know the truth of what had happened by the fountain, but she had a certainty born of long experience in little whimsy. As in every village she had ever observed, human nature would eventually reveal all. For now, however, she would wait, quietly attentive, noting the interplay of fear, guilt, and curiosity that danced across the faces of those around her. The garden party, once a tableau of genteel leisure, had become the stage for a far more compelling drama, and Miss Marple, ever patient, was ready to read every act. The news of Mr. Alistair Pritchard's collapse had spread through Little Whimsy with the insidious speed only a village could muster. By mid-morning, every shopkeeper, postman, and Sunday school teacher seemed to carry some version of the tale, each iteration embroidered with subtle embellishments and hints of suspicion. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the cobbled high street with her walking stick tapping lightly against the stones, could feel the invisible tension vibrating through the air, and she noted, with no small measure of satisfaction, how human imagination was working overtime even before the police had fully assessed the scene. The baker, Mr. Lowther, was the first to confront her, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron as he leaned on the counter. "Did you hear, Miss Marple? Alistair Pritchard, here at Oakwood Manor, right by the fountain, no less. Some say he's been poisoned. Others claim a full, clumsy fellow, if you ask me." He lowered his voice, as though confiding in a conspirator. I saw Mrs. Pennington's eyes darting about the garden when it happened. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded gently, folding her gloved hands over the handle of her stick. "Curious indeed. But sometimes, Mr. Lowther, the eyes of a lady merely follow the flowers she adores. That is hardly a scandal." Her tone was mild, but her mind catalogued every word, every hint of emphasis, like a careful librarian noting the slightest blemish on a treasured manuscript. Word of the incident had reached the inn, where gossip grew as eagerly as weeds in a neglected garden. Mrs. Barrow, the innkeeper, flourished her hands in dramatic disbelief as she recounted the tale to anyone who would listen. "I heard from the maid herself. Such a frightful sight. He fell as if pushed, I say. And there were whispers of a silver mask, though what a mask would be doing at a garden party, I cannot imagine." Miss Marple, passing the inn with a faint tilt of her head, allowed herself a small smile. The mention of a silver mask did not escape her notice. A detail so slight, yet in the hands of an imaginative village, it could morph into a key clue or a red herring or both. She filed it away carefully, mentally noting the precise words, the hesitations, and the expressions accompanying them. At the village post office, Mr. Cartwright, the postmaster, offered his own theory, leaning across the counter and lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Some say Pritchard had been arguing with the new curate, a chap from London. Something about the parish accounts, I hear. But you never know in Little Whimsy. People smile one moment and plot the next." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a faint line. Human nature, she reflected, could never be trusted at face value, especially in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. Later, in the quiet of her own sitting room, Miss Marple allowed herself a few moments to review the faces and reactions she had seen that morning. There was Lady Rowena, anxious but controlled, seemingly determined to maintain decorum. The younger guests, some of whom had been present at the fountain, were fluttering about in a mixture of curiosity and fear, while the household staff whispered nervously among themselves, each convinced that some dark motive must lie behind the unfortunate incident. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the subtle discrepancies she had observed the maid, who seemed too composed for someone who had witnessed such a shock, the gardener whose gaze shifted too rapidly from the body to Lady Rowena, and the small boy who had been feeding crumbs to the robin, suddenly pale and withdrawn. In the cacophony of gossip and speculation, these minor details might have seemed insignificant, but to Miss Marple they formed the delicate threads of a tapestry yet to be revealed. By the afternoon, the constable had arrived at the manor to collect formal statements. Miss Marple, observing from the window of her modest cottage across the street, noted the varying demeanors with meticulous attention. Some villagers were eager to speak, overcompensating with enthusiasm to appear helpful. Others were cautious, careful to choose their words so as not to implicate themselves. In every hesitation, every blush, she detected a small piece of the larger puzzle. Even as the formal investigation commenced, whispers persisted in hushed tones. A quarrel over money, perhaps, a jilted lover seeking revenge, the silver mask of someone in disguise. Theories collided, diverged, and multiplied. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by speculation. Her mind worked quietly, piecing together the subtle gestures, the unspoken tensions, and the fleeting expressions that marked true intent. By evening, the village seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm, though the incident by the fountain continued to occupy every conversation. Miss Marple, seated by her fire with a cup of tea, reflected on the human tendencies she had observed. The rush to judgment, the embellishment of facts, the concealment of motives, all of it, she knew, would eventually converge into the revelation of truth. But for now, the village had spoken, and she listened not to the words themselves, but to what they concealed. In little whimsy, appearances were cherished above all else, and yet the smallest cracks in that veneer could reveal astonishing truth. Miss Marple, smiling faintly as she turned a page in her knitting, understood that the day's events had only begun. The garden party had provided the catalyst, the village had provided the spectacle, and now it was her task to discern the story beneath the surface, patient and unassuming, as the drama quietly continued to unfold around her. The morning after the garden party, Oakwood Manor seemed to breathe an air of cautious restraint, as if the walls themselves were holding their collective breath. Miss Marple arrived promptly, walking through the village with her habitual slow and deliberate pace, the handle of her walking stick tapping lightly against the worn cobblestones. Though the villagers' gossip had been lively the previous day, there was a subdued, almost reverent tone in their greetings, as though everyone were aware that life in Little Whimsy had been irreversibly altered. Inside the manor, the household was in a state of quiet industry. Lady Rowena, perfectly coiffed despite the circumstances, moved from room to room directing the staff in a soft but commanding voice. The maid, Margaret, seemed unnaturally composed as she straightened silvered trays and polished cutlery, her fingers brushing lightly over the engraved designs with a precision born of habit or perhaps anxiety. Miss Marple, observing these movements, allowed herself a faint smile. Human behavior, she knew, was rarely as innocent as it appeared. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Lady Rowena, glancing up from her list of household tasks. "I hope you will forgive the early hour, but it seemed prudent to have someone familiar to guide us through these difficulties." Her eyes, though polite, were tinged with unease, and Miss Marple noted the subtle tightening of her jaw as she spoke. "Difficulties, indeed," Miss Marple replied lightly, adjusting her spectacles. "I trust the household is managing as well as can be expected." She allowed her gaze to sweep the room, taking in the small signs of stress and nervous anticipation, cataloguing them as a careful artist notes subtle shades in a painting. The local constable, Inspector Hayworth, arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him a meticulous air of official procedure. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I thought it best to gather all who were present at the garden party yesterday for brief interviews. I dare say it will help clarify the circumstances." His tone was professional, yet there was an undercurrent of hesitancy, as if he too felt the weight of the village's collective scrutiny. Miss Marple followed him through the manor, noting each guest's manner as they were approached for questioning. The elder Mr. Pennington, who had been particularly animated the previous day, now appeared subdued, leaning heavily on his walking stick and avoiding eye contact. Young Emily Cartwright, who had been feeding the robin by the fountain, fiddled nervously with the hem of her dress, glancing toward the spot where Mr. Pritchard had fallen. Each movement, each hesitation, offered Miss Marple a glimpse into the tangled web of emotions and hidden tensions that connected the villagers to one another. The doctor examined Mr. Pritchard. Inspector Hayworth explained quietly to Miss Marple as they moved through the rooms. "He's stable, though shaken. There's no clear sign of foul play, yet the circumstances are peculiar enough to warrant further investigation." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already mapping the intricate possibilities. Peculiar indeed, she thought. Peculiar in the way that subtle hints often concealed the most telling truths. As the interviews commenced, Miss Marple lingered in a quiet corner, her knitting basket resting on her lap, pretending to be occupied, while listening attentively. She noticed how Mr. Pennington's voice occasionally wavered, betraying a nervousness he attempted to mask with polite assertions. She observed Lady Rowena's controlled gestures, noting the way her hand lingered on the edge of the silver tray longer than necessary, and how Margaret the maid's eyes shifted frequently toward the hallway, as though expecting someone or something to emerge. Even the servants, who typically moved with practiced efficiency, revealed subtle signs of unease. The butler's posture stiffened whenever certain names were mentioned, the kitchen maid's humming ceased abruptly when anyone spoke of the silver mask, and a slight tremor in the hands of the housekeeper betrayed more than words could ever convey. Miss Marple made careful mental notes, knowing that in time these minor revelations might form the cornerstone of her understanding. When the interviews concluded, the villagers were left to their own devices, and a nervous stillness settled over the manor. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her eyes drifting to the fountain visible through the French windows. The faint glimmer of water hinted at yesterday's disturbance, but it was the small details, the faint smear on the marble edge, the slight displacement of a nearby flower pot that caught her attention. Such trifles might seem insignificant to the casual observer, yet Miss Marple had long learned that the smallest discrepancies often concealed the greatest truths. Later that afternoon, as she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple paused to observe the village once more. Groups of neighbors whispered in doorways, and the local grocer discussed theories of motives and quarrels as though rehearsing a play. Children peeked cautiously around corners, their curiosity unchecked by adult caution. All of it, Miss Marple thought, was a study in human nature, the rapid assumptions, the instinctive fear of being implicated, the subtle hierarchies of social power that dictated who could speak and who must remain silent. Back in the calm of her sitting room, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and reflected on the day's observations. There was no immediate clarity, no obvious culprit. Yet, as always, the interplay of gestures, glances, and whispered fears provided a map of intentions and secrets. One day, she mused, the threads would converge, revealing a pattern invisible to those who were too eager to assume, too quick to judge. For now, she would wait, patient as ever, allowing the village to reveal itself in small, telling increments. In little whimsy, as elsewhere, human nature offered all the clues one might require if only one possessed the patience to notice. By the following morning, the atmosphere in Little Whimsy had thickened into something tangible, like the heavy fog that occasionally rolled across the meadows in autumn. The garden party, which had been intended as a light-hearted celebration of Oakwood Manor's restoration, now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a tense scrutiny that touched every corner of the village. Miss Marple, moving along the familiar paths between cottages, noted with a quiet satisfaction how the villagers' habitual cheer had been supplanted by cautious whispers and tentative glances. Each gesture, each uttered speculation, carried with it a subtle clue, an insight into the hidden connections of human nature that she had spent years learning to interpret. The first person to attract the scrutiny of the authorities was young Peter Cartwright, whose presence near the fountain during Mr. Pritchard's fall had not gone unnoticed. The constable, Inspector Hayworth, appeared at the village square mid-morning, his expression carefully neutral, though there was a flicker of certainty in his eyes that betrayed his leaning toward the obvious narrative. "I'll need to speak with Peter Cartwright," he announced to the gathering villagers, who immediately began murmuring among themselves. He was closest to the incident. Naturally, it's prudent to clarify any involvement. Peter, a boy of barely 17, looked pale and uncertain as he was ushered toward the inspector. Miss Marple observed the interaction quietly, noting the subtle signs of fear in his posture, the way his fingers twitched against the edge of his coat. Yet beneath that surface of anxiety, she detected no malice. It was a nervousness born of circumstance, not guilt, a distinction too often overlooked by those eager to reach a conclusion. Meanwhile, Lady Rowena, upon hearing that Peter had been singled out, gathered her composure with remarkable precision. The boy had no ill intent, she remarked, her voice steady but firm, carrying over the murmurs of the villagers. He was merely where chance placed him. We must not jump to conclusions. Miss Marple, standing slightly aside, allowed the observation to settle in her mind. Lady Rowena's insistence was layered with genuine concern for propriety, yet she spoke with an awareness of the implications of public perception, a subtle dance between empathy and social positioning that often revealed more than the words themselves. The investigation extended beyond Peter, of course. Mr. Pennington, still recovering from the shock, became a subject of interest due to his previous quarrel with Mr. Pritchard over estate matters. Neighbors whispered about disputes concerning property boundaries and inheritance, exaggerating minor disagreements into potential motives for foul play. Miss Marple, listening to the various conjectures while maintaining the guise of polite curiosity, mentally catalogued these tensions, noting which reactions seemed rehearsed and which betrayed genuine concern. Even the household staff were not beyond suspicion. Margaret, the maid who had been so composed, was gently questioned about her movements during the party. Her explanations were consistent and straightforward, yet Miss Marple observed the fleeting twitch of her mouth, the way her eyes occasionally darted toward the hallway, and the subtle change in her breathing when the silver mask was mentioned. These nuances were far more telling than the words she spoke aloud, and Miss Marple, as always, recorded them carefully in her mind. By mid-afternoon, the village's social dynamic had shifted noticeably. The obvious suspect, the boy, Peter Cartwright, became a focal point for speculation and moral judgment. Even some of his peers, eager to distance themselves from suspicion, whispered tales of what they thought they had seen, embellishing the details with a vividness that bordered on theatricality. Miss Marple, walking through the quiet streets and past the shops, noted the inclination of human beings to attach themselves to the simplest narrative, particularly when it absolved them of any personal scrutiny. A curious encounter took place in the village square when Mrs. Pennington approached Miss Marple, her hands fluttering nervously. "I cannot help but feel," she said in a low voice, "that young Peter might have been involved, though I cannot imagine how. Perhaps it is a coincidence, yet the placement of that fountain seems almost deliberate." Miss Marple offered a mild, reassuring smile. Coincidences, Mrs. Pennington, often appear deliberate until one knows the mind behind them. And sometimes the mind is not guilty at all, merely caught in circumstance. Meanwhile, Inspector Hayworth collected statements with a methodical air, jotting down the words and occasionally raising a skeptical eyebrow. He seemed eager to close the case, his mind drawn to the most apparent explanations rather than the subtle undercurrents that might reveal the deeper truth. He questioned Peter about his movements, his relationship with Mr. Pritchard, and any disagreements he might have overheard, while the villagers watched silently, waiting for some indication of guilt. The boy's responses were honest and simple, yet the collective desire for resolution transformed his nervousness into a presumed confession in the minds of onlookers. Miss Marple, observing from the doorway, noted how the villagers' eagerness to find a culprit could cloud judgment. Human nature, she reflected, had a tendency to cling to certainty even when none existed. She made mental notes not only of Peter's manner but also of the reactions of those around him. The subtle relief in the voice of one neighbor, the cautious glance from another, the hushed mutters of agreement that seemed to confirm suspicions rather than challenge them. As the afternoon waned into early evening, Oakwood Manor settled into an uneasy quiet. Peter, though formally released for the time being, remained under the subtle scrutiny of the villagers, whose watchful eyes followed him home along the winding lanes. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage, reflected on the morning's events. The obvious suspect had been identified, yet nothing in her careful observation suggested he was truly responsible. Indeed, she sensed that the real solution lay elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of social niceties and understated deceit. Seated by her fire, later that evening, Miss Marple reviewed her mental notes. The silver mask, the body's position, the subtle reactions of each observer, these were threads that required delicate weaving to reveal the truth. For now, the village had focused on the simplest, most apparent explanation, but she, with her quiet understanding of human behavior, knew that appearances were often misled and that the true culprit might be the one least suspected. In Little Whimsy, the game of observation had only just begun, and Miss Marple, patient and discerning, was determined to watch every move until the final picture emerged with clarity. The next morning, Little Whimsy awoke under a gentle, pale sun that seemed almost incongruous against the unease lingering in its streets. The whispers and cautious glances of the previous day had settled into a low hum of speculation, with villagers moving about their routines, yet never quite touching the edges of the recent disturbance. Miss Marple, walking deliberately through the familiar lanes toward Oakwood Manor, allowed herself a quiet appreciation for the way human life persisted, even in the shadow of uncertainty. It was in these small continuities, the little rhythms of daily life, that she often discovered the first hints of truth hidden amid layers of rumor and assumption. Inside the manor, the household was once again astir. Lady Rowena, impeccably attired even at this early hour, was in the library reviewing documents relating to the recent events. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, a faint relief in her expression that betrayed the underlying tension she worked so hard to conceal. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth and courteous. "I trust you have had a comfortable journey." Her eyes, however, betrayed a hint of anxious expectation, and Miss Marple noted the subtle curl of her fingers around the edge of the velvet chair, a gesture betraying more than the composed voice could ever admit. "I did, thank you," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her glasses, "and I trust the household is managing well in these unusual circumstances." She allowed the pause to linger, giving Lady Rowena the space to reveal more through silence than she might through words. Meanwhile, in the hall, the butler, Mr. Collins, was busy arranging the morning papers and reviewing the ledger. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a slight displacement among the fine silverware on the sideboard. One of the spoons, ordinarily resting perfectly parallel with its companions, had been nudged slightly askew. On its own, this seemed insignificant, but Miss Marple's practiced eye caught the faint smudge along its handle, as though it had been handled hurriedly or perhaps deliberately moved. Such trifles, she knew, were often overlooked by those seeking only the dramatic gestures of guilt, yet they frequently contained more truth than a dozen interrogations. Later, as Miss Marple moved toward the drawing-room to take tea, she observed the subtle dynamics among the villagers gathered there. Mr. Pennington, though outwardly calm, displayed a nervous tension in the way he tapped his cane against the polished floor, each beat slightly off from the natural rhythm. Emily Cartwright, now accompanied by her mother, kept glancing toward the French windows where the fountain stood, her expression guarded, as though some silent anxiety persisted, despite assurances from adults that all was well. Each minor hesitation, each fleeting glance, was catalogued in Miss Marple's mind, forming a growing tapestry of behavior that spoke louder than words. It was during this quiet observation that Miss Marple's attention was caught by an object that, to others, would have seemed inconsequential. Resting against the corner of the mantelpiece was the silver mask itself, hastily removed from its usual display after the incident. Its intricate filigree gleamed dully in the morning light, and a subtle bend along one edge hinted at recent handling. Most notably, there was a faint smudge of what appeared to be soil along its rim. Miss Marple's mind quietly pieced together possibilities of who had touched it last, and why would a visitor or household member handle it with such carelessness that traces of the outside world adhered to its surface. It was a small clue, easily dismissed, yet in Miss Marple's experience, the smallest details often carried the weightiest truths. Miss Marple approached the mask with deliberate caution, lifting it slightly with her gloved hands to inspect the base. Beneath it, she discovered a nearly imperceptible scratch on the polished mahogany mantelpiece, parallel to the smudge she had noticed. The alignment was such that the mask had been placed, and perhaps moved with deliberate care, or perhaps to conceal some unintended action. She made a mental note to observe which of the household had access, and who might have possessed both the curiosity and the opportunity to handle the object in this manner. The afternoon brought a visit from the local doctor, Dr. Farnsworth, who had come to assess Mr. Pritchard's ongoing recovery. He carried himself with the air of professional detachment, though Miss Marple noted the occasional tension in his expression when the silver mask was mentioned. "Mr. Pritchard is physically unharmed," he explained, though his nerves remain understandably frazzled. The sudden shock, coupled with the social embarrassment of the incident, has left him somewhat shaken. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath her spectacles, registered the slight flicker in his gaze toward the corner where the mask rested. A professional reaction, or perhaps something more personal. The thought lodged in her mind. Meanwhile, the villagers, now accustomed to the narrative focusing on Peter Cartwright, continued to speculate openly about motives and opportunities. Each whispered theory revealed as much about the speaker as about the supposed perpetrator, offering Miss Marple additional insight into the underlying tensions and resentments simmering beneath the village's tranquil surface. Mr. Pennington's rivalry with Mr. Pritchard, Lady Rowena's discreet management of household politics, and even the servant's subtle avoidance of certain topics all formed threads in the complex tapestry of human interactions. As evening fell, Miss Marple retired to her sitting room, bringing with her the quiet satisfaction of someone who had observed much yet revealed little. The silver mask, the subtle scratches, the faint traces of soil, the villagers' gestures, all of these were pieces of a puzzle that, while incomplete, suggested patterns she had seen countless times before. The solution was not yet apparent to anyone else, yet she felt the threads beginning to converge in her mind. In little whimsy, as elsewhere, it was often the overlooked, the nearly invisible, that provided the key to understanding. Settling into her chair with a cup of tea, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The obvious suspect had been entertained, yet she knew that human behavior rarely aligned neatly with appearances. The mask, The minor smudges, the fleeting glances and nervous gestures, these were far more telling than the broad accusations circulating among the villagers. Patience, as always, would be her ally. And in the quiet of her cottage, she allowed herself a faint smile, confident that in due course the hidden truth would emerge, revealed by those subtle clues others had been too eager to overlook. The morning mist lingered longer than usual over Little Whimsy, clinging to the hedgerows and stretching lazily across the cobbled streets. Within the village, the atmosphere was charged with the muted tension of unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple, walking with her customary measured pace, noticed the subtle shifts in behavior from one neighbor to the next, furtive glances, hesitant greetings, and the occasional whispered remark, all of which carried more meaning than any overt declaration. The recent tragedy had rippled beneath the surface of the village's genteel exterior, revealing fractures that had long been concealed by civility and habit. Miss Marple's first stop was the home of Lady Rowena, who, despite her polished composure, seemed increasingly burdened by the responsibility of maintaining social order. The drawing room, where a few close acquaintances had gathered, was filled with the quiet hum of uneasy conversation. Mr. Pennington, unable to resist addressing the elephant in the room, had taken it upon himself to speak first. "It is remarkable," he began, his tone sharp, "how a simple accident, or perhaps something more, can unravel so much that was thought settled. Old disagreements, ancient grievances all come to the surface in moments such as these." Lady Rowena's response was measured, yet it carried a subtle edge. "Indeed, Mr. Pennington, but one must exercise caution before assigning blame. Not every misfortune has its roots in malice." Her eyes flickered ever so slightly toward Miss Marple, who, with quiet assurance, nodded subtly in recognition of the truth behind the words. Human nature, she reminded herself, was often more revealing in what it sought to conceal than in what it admitted aloud. Miss Marple soon realized that the events of the previous day had stirred not only curiosity, but also long-suppressed rivalries. She observed how Mr. Pennington, with his usual blend of arrogance and charm, seemed to subtly assert his dominance, probing into Lady Rowena's account of the manor's restoration and Mr. Pritchard's financial dealings. Each question, while innocuous on the surface, hinted at deeper grievances, suggesting that the villa's recent troubles were entwined with a web of historical resentments. Meanwhile, Emily Cartwright, who had spent the morning quietly helping her mother arrange flowers in the sitting-room, exhibited signs of nervous agitation. Miss Marple, seated at a corner table with a cup of tea, watched as Emily's hands trembled slightly while arranging the blooms. Her mind catalogued the incongruities, the hurried adjustments of petals, the furtive glances toward the windows where the silver mask had been displayed, and the subtle avoidance of certain topics during conversation. There was more than youthful anxiety in these behaviors. There was the unmistakable trace of something that had been kept secret. As the morning progressed, the village constable, Inspector Hayworth, continued his inquiries, now extending beyond Peter Cartwright to encompass the wider circle of Oakwood Manor's social sphere. His questions, though methodical, often met with polite evasions or carefully constructed answers. Miss Marple, ever attentive to the nuances of human behavior, noticed how certain individuals unconsciously revealed themselves. Lady Rowena's slight hesitation before answering questions regarding Mr. Pritchard's late-night visitors, for instance, or Mr. Pennington's barely perceptible tightening of his jaw when asked about his earlier disputes with the deceased, these were not the signs of guilty acts, but of emotions entwined with long-held secrets. Later, as the villagers gathered in small clusters outside the manor, a confrontation subtly unfolded. Mrs. Pennington, speaking in a voice low enough for only a few to hear, addressed Lady Rowena. "I cannot help but wonder, Lady Rowena, whether there has been more beneath the surface than any of us suspected. Surely you must have known of certain disagreements, even if they were hushed in polite conversation." Lady Rowena's eyes met Mrs. Pennington's with a flash of controlled emotion. "There are always matters best left undisturbed, Mrs. Pennington," she replied calmly, yet the very steadiness of her tone suggested a history that had not been entirely innocuous. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a smaller, quieter scene. Margaret, the maid, had paused in the hall to exchange words with a visiting neighbor, her voice barely audible. The conversation, though seemingly mundane, carried the weight of revelation. Margaret's subtle hesitations, the way she lowered her gaze before lifting it again, and her brief, fleeting frown all suggested a knowledge she was reluctant to disclose. Miss Marple quietly observed, aware that the smallest gestures often contained the largest truths, and that the mask of propriety sometimes concealed motives more effectively than any spoken declaration. It was during this interval of delicate confrontations that Miss Marple noticed Mr. Collins, the butler, quietly inspecting the mantelpiece once more. His movements were practiced, unobtrusive, yet Miss Marple caught the faintest glimmer of unease in his eyes. There was something about the careful manner in which he adjusted the silver candelabra, the almost imperceptible repositioning of the small trinkets that lined the shelf, which spoke of a consciousness beyond mere housekeeping. Subtle, deliberate actions such as these often concealed concerns that the untrained eye might dismiss entirely. By afternoon, the pattern of secrets, resentments, and veiled accusations had woven itself into a rich tapestry of suspicion. Villagers who had once shared casual greetings now spoke with cautious scrutiny, their expressions hinting at unspoken judgments. Mr. Pennington's pointed remarks about Mr. Pritchard's late-night meetings, Lady Rowena's careful deflection of probing questions, and the silent observations of the household staff all converged in Miss Marple's mind, forming a lattice of potential motives and opportunities that required meticulous examination. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple retreated to the solace of her cottage, tea in hand, reflecting on the delicate interplay of personalities she had witnessed. The confrontation among villagers, while polite and measured on the surface, had revealed fissures in relationships that were previously concealed by routine and civility. Hidden tensions had been nudged toward the light, and in the resulting clarity, Miss Marple could perceive connections invisible to the casual observer. The subtle cues, the fleeting gestures, and the careful choice of words formed a web that, when traced with patience, might ultimately illuminate the path to the true instigator behind the unsettling events at Oakwood Manor. In the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple contemplated the unfolding situation. Human behavior, she reminded herself, was seldom straightforward. Each confrontation had brought with it fragments of truth, carefully disguised by politeness, habit, and fear. As the shadows lengthened across the village, she felt the pieces beginning to shift ever so slightly, nudging her closer to the revelation that remained, for now, tantalizingly, just beyond reach. Patience and observation would, as always, reveal what the hurried assumptions of others could not. The following morning arrived with an unexpected sharpness in the air, a chill that seemed to penetrate even the most well-insulated corners of Little Whimsy. The previous day's confrontations and veiled exchanges had left the village in a state of subdued tension, yet life continued its measured pace, punctuated by the clatter of hooves along cobbled streets and the distant chiming of the parish clock. Miss Marple, ever observant, set out early for Oakwood Manor, taking care to note the small yet telling changes in her neighbor's comportment. It was in the subtleties, the hastily folded shawls, the unusually tight handshakes, the flickers of expression at otherwise mundane comments that she found the most revealing clues. As she approached the manor, a small group had already gathered near the main entrance. Their whispers, though subdued, carried over the morning stillness, and Miss Marple immediately detected the undercurrent of agitation. The constable, Inspector Hayworth, stood at the edge of the crowd, frowning and consulting a small notebook. "I hardly like to say it," he muttered to a nearby villager, "but it seems we have another incident to attend to." His words carried a weight that instantly captured attention, and the murmurs grew louder. Inside the manor, the scene that greeted them was both startling and perplexing. On the side lawn, a garden statue, a sculpted cherub that had long been a familiar decorative element, now lay shattered in pieces, the fragments scattered in a chaotic arc across the flower beds. It was evident that the destruction had occurred overnight, for the dew clung to the broken marble in an almost unnatural way, highlighting the jagged edges of the ruin. No one had reported the disturbance during the previous evening, and the sudden discovery sent an immediate ripple of speculation through the assembled villagers. Miss Marple, taking in the scene with calm precision, observed the reactions of those around her. Mr. Pennington, who had been so quick to assign motives in the earlier confrontation, now exhibited an uncharacteristic hesitation, his brow furrowed as he assessed the damage. Lady Rowena, poised as ever, maintained a composed exterior, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. The household staff moved with quiet urgency, ensuring that the scene remained intact for any formal examination, while Emily Cartwright, pale and trembling, clutched a handkerchief in her hands, as if to shield herself from the possibility that the shattered cherub symbolized something more ominous than mere misfortune. "What a curious turn of events," Miss Marple remarked softly, her tone carrying the casual cadence of someone making an observation rather than issuing a judgment. "I cannot help but notice, however, that the fragments are distributed in a very particular pattern. It suggests more than an accidental tumble. There is intent here, subtle but deliberate." Her eyes swept over the broken sculpture, cataloguing the position of each fragment, the direction of impact, and the absence of any footprints or disturbances in the surrounding soil that might indicate a hasty escape. The inspector, shifting uneasily, consulted his notebook once more. "There are no signs of forced entry," he murmured. "No indication that anyone entered the grounds unlawfully. Yet clearly, someone or perhaps something has caused this damage intentionally. I must admit, I'm puzzled." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, aware that his sense of confusion was precisely the lens through which she could see what others overlooked. She made a mental note of the positions of witnesses, the timing of their arrivals, and the subtle ways in which each individual sought either to assert authority or withdraw from scrutiny. Among the small assembly, a new element soon emerged. Mrs. Pennington, who had remained at the periphery, spoke in a voice hushed yet insistent. "I do believe," she said, glancing toward Lady Rowena, "that this is more than just an accident. Did you notice, my dear, that the silver mask, the one associated with the manor's masquerade, has vanished?" The sudden mention of the missing mask drew immediate attention. Gasps punctuated the morning air, and Emily Cartwright's hand flew to her mouth in shock. The silver mask, an artifact of considerable local fascination, had disappeared without a trace, and its absence introduced a complication that threatened to overshadow all previous suspicions. Miss Marple, however, allowed herself only a quiet nod. She understood instinctively that the theft and the destruction were not random acts, but deliberate messages, carefully constructed to provoke anxiety and perhaps to conceal something far subtler. Observing the villagers' reactions, she noted the interplay of relief, indignation, and fear, the very emotions that could cloud judgment and reveal the true perpetrator if approached with tact and subtlety. Lady Rowena, recovering her composure with grace, addressed the group. "This is most troubling. The mask is not merely a decorative item. It carries with it memories, symbols, and a certain degree of prestige. Whoever is responsible must have a reason that goes beyond mere mischief." Her eyes met those of Mr. Pennington, who shrugged with an expression that was almost apologetic, yet undeniably curious. Each glance, each shift in posture, each micro-expression added layers of understanding for Miss Marple, who catalogued them silently. The inspector, still frowning, turned to Miss Marple. "It seems, Miss Marple, that our simple case has acquired a rather theatrical complication. Perhaps your keen insight could illuminate what I am missing. She accepted the inquiry with her usual modesty, replying only that observation often revealed more than questioning, and that human behavior, when carefully noted, could disclose truths hidden beneath the surface of polite discourse. As the morning wore on, more villagers arrived, each drawn by the commotion. Among them, Mr. Pritchard appeared notably distressed, his expression taut, as though the events of the previous day were colliding with some private anxiety. He inquired discreetly about the silver mask, yet offered no explanation for his own agitation, prompting Miss Marple to file away the anomaly for later consideration. There was a story in that silence, she suspected, one that might provide clarity once all pieces fell into place. By midday, the combined presence of residents and constabulary created a tense tableau in the manor gardens. The shattered cherub and the vanished mask had transformed what was initially perceived as an isolated incident into a web of intrigue that threatened to engulf the village entirely. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart yet attentive, considered the interplay of motives, the delicate balance of social alliances, and the psychological impulses that might drive someone to such acts. It was, she knew, another twist in a complex narrative that would ultimately reveal not only the character of the perpetrator but also the subtle interconnections among all involved. As the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving only the most concerned parties, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, noting the angles of sunlight on the flower beds and the absence of certain footprints where one might have expected them. She sensed that the day's revelation, the simultaneous destruction and disappearance, was not an isolated prank, but a carefully calculated maneuver, one intended to mislead and to test reactions. In the quiet that followed, she resolved that patience, observation, and subtle deduction would illuminate the path forward. For now, she would watch, and the village, unaware of the depths of insight silently accumulating, would reveal its truths in time. The evening air carried a faint chill as Miss Marple made her way back to St. Mary Mead, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her shoes punctuating the silence of the country lanes. Though the village seemed outwardly calm, she knew that beneath the polite facades, anxiety and suspicion festered like embers waiting for a breeze. The events at Oakwood Manor, the shattered cherub, and the missing silver mask had introduced a tension that left no corner of Little Whimsy untouched. The villagers' behavior over the past 24 hours had offered a wealth of subtle clues, and now Miss Marple felt the time had come to test them, to observe their reactions when confronted with carefully chosen provocations. Her first visit was to Lady Rowena, who had agreed to host a small gathering under the pretext of tea, a social occasion that would provide ample opportunity for observation without arousing suspicion. The drawing room was immaculately arranged, with delicate china and laced doilies lending an air of domestic serenity that contrasted sharply with the turmoil beneath the surface. Lady Rowena, attired in a soft lavender gown, welcomed Miss Marple with a warm smile, though a faint crease of worry marked her forehead. "I trust you found Oakwood Manor in order?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes darting ever so slightly toward the entrance, as if expecting the unexpected. "I did, thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, seating herself near the window, where she could observe without drawing attention. "I must say, the garden is quite remarkable, even in its current state." Her words carried the weight of understatement, a subtle nudge that invited reflection without accusation. Lady Rowena glanced at the window, noting the fading light, and then at the hostess, as if measuring her response. Miss Marple made a careful note of these slight reactions, pauses, glances, and shifts in posture, each one a potential thread in the tapestry of deception. As tea was served, the other guests arrived, each selected for their potential relevance to the events at Oakwood Manor. Mr. Pennington entered with his usual air of confident curiosity, yet there was an unusual tension in his movements, a slight rigidity that betrayed an underlying unease. Emily Cartwright followed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes wide and attentive, though her posture suggested both fear and anticipation. Mr. Pritchard came last, his expression guarded, as if he were expecting an interrogation under the guise of polite conversation. Miss Marple welcomed each arrival with gentle attentiveness, offering simple observations that seemed innocuous, yet subtly probed their reactions. The conversation began with trivialities, remarks on the weather, recent parish events, and the quality of Lady Rowena's tea. Yet Miss Marple skillfully steered the discussion toward more delicate topics. "It is curious," she remarked casually, "how certain objects can evoke such strong feelings. Take, for example, the silver mask at Oakwood Manor. One might imagine it holds more than mere decorative value for those who have long cherished it." She allowed the statement to linger, noting the subtle stiffening of shoulders, the almost imperceptible tightening of lips, and the quickened breathing of several guests. Mr. Pennington, attempting to maintain composure, offered a measured response. "Indeed, Miss Marple, though I confess I cannot imagine it inspiring such dramatic consequences." His tone was carefully neutral, yet his hands, resting on the table, betrayed a slight tremor. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, knowing smile, recognizing the classic signs of a man under observation, testing his restraint. Emily Cartwright, sensing the tension, murmured, "I am certain that whoever caused the damage had no intention of theft. It was meant to frighten, perhaps confuse or mislead." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle hesitance, the shadow of uncertainty behind her words. It was the kind of pause that suggested knowledge withheld, or perhaps fear of revealing too much. Lady Rowena, ever composed, offered, "We must also consider that the damage to the cherub and the disappearance of the mask are connected in ways that elude ordinary observation. It is not merely the act itself, but the intent behind it that matters." She glanced at Miss Marple with an expression that was at once respectful and slightly challenging, as if testing whether the old lady could see beyond the obvious. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point while reserving judgment. The next portion of her subtle test involved a small object, carefully selected from her handbag, a miniature replica of the silver mask, its features delicate but unmistakably similar to the original. She placed it on the tea table, allowing it to catch the light just enough to draw attention, and remarked casually, "I happened to find this little trinket in a most unexpected place. It reminded me, rather forcibly, of Oakwood Manor and its treasures." She watched carefully as each guest reached some with polite interest, others with fleeting expressions of surprise, and one in particular with a momentary shadow of recognition that passed almost too quickly for an untrained eye to detect. Mr. Pritchard's hand twitched slightly toward the object before he pulled it back, his gaze darting around the room. It was a small gesture, but for Miss Marple it spoke volumes. She catalogued the micro-expression, the brief constriction of the jaw, and the way his eyes avoided direct contact with the replica. These subtle cues, when considered alongside previous observations, the tension at Oakwood Manor, the guarded statements, the hesitancy in conversation formed a pattern that was becoming increasingly clear in her mind. By the time tea was concluded, Miss Marple had gathered sufficient behavioral evidence to form a working hypothesis. She allowed the gathering to continue naturally, engaging in light conversation that seemed benign while her mind worked quietly to align the disparate threads of motive, opportunity, and psychological inclination. She noted which guests sought to dominate conversation, which withdrew, and which displayed fleeting signs of guilt, anxiety, or deflection. Each nuance was another brushstroke in a portrait that was only now beginning to reveal its contours. As the guests departed, expressing thanks and cordiality, Miss Marple lingered, reflecting on the subtle dynamics that had unfolded. The final test had been revealing one individual's reactions, suggested a careful orchestration of deception, a precise alignment of misdirection and concealed knowledge. She understood, with the clarity of long experience, that the path to uncovering the truth lay not in force or confrontation, but in patience, in the careful unraveling of psychological subtleties. When she finally stepped out into the crisp evening air, Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The pieces were in place, the threads of human behavior traced, and the moment of revelation drew near. The next encounter, the careful alignment of circumstances and conversation, would expose the perpetrator in a manner both subtle and definitive. Little Whimsy would soon discover that what appeared as chaos was in fact a carefully orchestrated narrative, and Miss Marple, as ever, would guide the villagers gently toward the truth. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, casting intricate patterns upon the polished floorboards. Miss Marple, seated in her customary armchair by the window, sipped her tea with deliberate calm, allowing the warmth to settle into her bones while her mind continued to churn through the observations of the previous evening. The subtle reactions, the brief hesitations, the almost imperceptible gestures, all of them had coalesced into a single, coherent picture. Today, the truth would be drawn from the shadows and placed firmly into the light. Her first visitor of the morning was Inspector Craddock, who arrived with a brisk knock and a brisker expression, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple, I hope I am not intruding, but Oakwood Manor has been in something of a state this morning, and I thought it prudent to confer with you before matters proceed any further." His tone carried a mixture of respect and mild exasperation, a reflection of the inspector's habitual struggle to balance official procedure with the nuanced insights of the village's most unassuming detective. "Not at all," Inspector Miss Marple replied, her voice measured and unassuming, masking the keen anticipation in her eyes. "I thought perhaps we might take a walk through the manor, and then I could offer some thoughts on the matter. You will understand, of course, that what I observed last evening at Lady Rowena's gathering may shed light on a few details that have otherwise been overlooked." She set down her cup with deliberate care, allowing a pause to emphasize the importance of her words, while simultaneously gauging the inspector's reaction. Craddock nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. The two walked in silence along the winding paths that led to Oakwood Manor, their footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of fallen leaves. The manor, when they arrived, seemed unusually still, the grandeur of its architecture muted by the somber air surrounding the recent events. Windows reflected the morning light, yet behind them lingered the faintest impression of unease, a subtle whisper of secrets that had not yet fully revealed themselves. Miss Marple led the way to the drawing-room where the silver mask had been displayed. The shattered cherub lay carefully wrapped in linen, awaiting formal investigation, while the empty display case spoke volumes to those attuned to the significance of absence. She paused before the case, hands clasped in front of her, and let her gaze sweep across the room, noting the angles of shadows and the positions in which objects had been left. "Inspector," she began softly, "the culprit's intent was not simply to take or destroy, but to manipulate perception to create a narrative that would lead everyone astray. And in that narrative, certain behaviors, tiny, nearly invisible behaviors, betray the true author of this mischief." Craddock listened intently, pen poised, aware that Miss Marple's insights often transcended ordinary observation. "I must confess, Miss Marple, I'm curious. Of all those present yesterday evening, who do you suspect?" His voice was careful, respectful, yet laced with the eagerness of a man unaccustomed to the quiet unraveling of human motives. "Let us consider," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle, almost conversational, as if she were remarking on the weather rather than orchestrating a revelation. There was Mr. Pritchard, whose reaction to the replica of the silver mask was fleeting, yet revealing. His hand twitched, his gaze momentarily avoided contact, and there was a subtle constriction of the jaw that suggested something hidden, Then there was Emily Cartwright, whose anxiety seemed genuine but who lacked the calculated misdirection necessary to stage such a series of events. And Mr. Pennington, while attentive, displayed no such signs of duplicity, merely curiosity, as one might expect from a man of his nature. She paused, letting the inspector absorb the distinctions, noting his slight furrow of concentration as he attempted to reconcile her deductions with the evidence he had gathered. "You see, Inspector, the truth rarely lies in what is most obvious. It is in the manner of engagement, the subtle play of attention and distraction. The silver mask itself, its disappearance, and the apparent destruction of the cherub was a device, a smokescreen to mask a far simpler, yet more personal, motive." Craddock leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "And that motive would be," he prompted, though he instinctively sensed that he might be about to witness one of Miss Marple's signature unveilings, where the simplicity of the truth belied the complexity of the deception. Miss Marple turned, her eyes alight with quiet determination. "It was a desire, Inspector. Desire intertwined with resentment, a combination that often leads to irrational action masked by reason. Mr. Pritchard, though outwardly composed, is a man familiar with the routines and expectations of Oakwood Manor, yet someone who has long felt slighted, overlooked, and underestimated. He understood the effect of the mask, the symbolic value of the cherub, and how these could be leveraged to create panic and misdirection among those who assumed they were observing reality." Craddock's eyebrows rose in astonishment. "You are certain, Miss Marple?" "As certain as one can be from observation," she replied, her voice steady. "And if we proceed carefully, allowing the circumstances to guide the revelation, we will see his own reactions confirm the truth without need for coercion. The confrontation need only be subtle enough to prompt the micro-expression that betrays the carefully hidden guilt." With deliberate precision, Miss Marple arranged a gathering later that afternoon, inviting those most closely connected to Oakwood Manor. The replica of the silver mask was again present, positioned to catch the light and the attention of the room. Conversation meandered as before, casual and seemingly benign, yet each word, glance, and gesture was strategically observed. Mr. Pritchard, despite his attempts at composure, could not entirely mask the slight tightening of his hands, the brief avoidance of the replica, and the subtle tremor in his voice when the masked history was mentioned. Miss Marple, observing all, allowed the room to fill with polite exchanges and unguarded comments from others, gradually cornering the psychological space in which Pritchard's reactions became unmistakable. Finally, she addressed him directly, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Mr. Pritchard, it seems the mask has a story far greater than any of us imagined. Perhaps you could recount how it came to be so precariously displayed." The color drained slightly from his face, his eyes flitting to the miniature mask, then to Miss Marple, and finally settling on nothing in particular. "I can explain," he stammered, the carefully constructed facade faltering under the weight of observation. "It was meant only as a lesson, nothing more." "I did not intend." His voice faltered completely as the assembled guests looked on, comprehension dawning in their expressions. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, yet carried the undeniable authority of her reasoning. "Mr. Pritchard, the lesson has indeed been learned, though perhaps not in the manner you intended. The pattern of your behavior, the inconsistencies, the minor betrayals of composure, all of it reveals a truth that words alone could not convey." She gestured toward the replica, toward the room, and toward the collective awareness of the villagers. "And now, the story is clear for all to see." The room held a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the careful exhale of those who had followed the unfolding drama. Mr. Pritchard sank into a chair, defeated, while the villagers absorbed the reality of the revelation. Miss Marple, serene as ever, allowed a faint, knowing smile to touch her lips. The puzzle was complete, the enigma resolved, and the delicate balance of justice maintained through patience, observation, and the quiet power of human understanding. The days following the revelation at Oakwood Manor passed with a peculiar mixture of relief and unease. The villagers of St. Mary Mead, while grateful that the mystery had been unraveled and the silver mask's enigma clarified, could not entirely shake the lingering tension that had seeped into their lives. Conversations, once light and filled with the trivialities of everyday existence, now carried the faint undertone of suspicion, a reminder that even the most familiar faces could conceal motives as complex as the labyrinthine paths in the manor's gardens. Miss Marple, meanwhile, settled back into her routine with remarkable composure, yet her mind remained quietly active, replaying the subtleties of human behavior she had observed during the unraveling of the case. The morning air was crisp as she walked through her garden, her pace unhurried but deliberate. The roses, trimmed with care, seemed to nod in acknowledgement of the season's change, while the faint scent of lavender hinted at distant fields beyond the village boundaries. As she moved along the gravel path, she considered the reactions of those involved, noting how the revelation had affected each individual differently. Some, like Emily Cartwright, were relieved and visibly more relaxed, as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Others, particularly those whose judgment had been clouded by assumptions, now approached their acquaintances with a subtle wariness, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Miss Marple as if to silently question whether she had anticipated the outcome all along. Inspector Craddock paid his customary visit later that morning, bringing with him the official acknowledgement that the matter at Oakwood Manor was formally concluded. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "I must commend you again. The explanations you provided during the gathering yesterday were both clear and precise. Without your observations, I fear the truth might have remained obscured for some time, perhaps indefinitely." His voice conveyed admiration tempered by a professional restraint, a combination that reflected both his respect for the village's unassuming detective and his awareness of the delicate social fabric she navigated so deftly. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded neatly over her lap. "Inspector," one merely observes, "it is rarely a matter of intellect alone. People, as you will discover throughout your career, have a remarkable way of revealing themselves when given the right circumstances, often without realizing they are doing so." Her tone, gentle yet imbued with quiet authority, left no room for disagreement, and Craddock nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. There was a shared understanding that the events at Oakwood Manor, while resolved, had offered lessons beyond the simple identification of the culprit. Word of Mr. Pritchard's unmasking both literal and figurative travels through the village with the characteristic mixture of gossip and speculation that St. Mary Mead cherished. Tea rooms buzzed with discussion, some praising Miss Marple's keen perception, others expressing disbelief at how long such subtleties could have remained unnoticed. The local newspaper, always eager for stories that combined intrigue with the familiar charm of village life, carried a measured report on the incident, emphasizing the resolution and the absence of violence, yet leaving readers with a tantalizing hint of the psychological nuance involved. The article credited the inspector's diligence, though discerning villagers knew to whom the true insight belonged. In the manor itself, life gradually resumed its rhythm, though the atmosphere was subtly altered. Lady Rowena, who had initially received visitors with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity, now moved through her rooms with a composed elegance, her hands deftly arranging the ornaments and vases that had previously been hastily adjusted in response to the mask's disappearance. Mr. Pennington returned to his studies, the shadows of suspicion that had briefly fallen over him dissipating, while Emily Cartwright took a quiet walk in the gardens each afternoon, her demeanor more serene and confident, buoyed by the reassurance that honesty and transparency had ultimately prevailed. Miss Marple, observant as ever, paid careful attention to the ongoing dynamics. She noticed, for instance, that some villagers, despite the clarity of the resolution, still carried a residual curiosity about the intricacies of Mr. Pritchard's motives. Questions whispered behind closed doors, such as why he had acted with such calculated precision, or how he had chosen the timing for his deception, suggested that human nature remained a source of endless fascination. Even those who had felt themselves peripheral to the events could not resist pondering the subtleties, recognizing the delicate interplay between pride, envy, and the desire for recognition that had fueled the entire affair. In her own home, Miss Marple found a quiet satisfaction in the continuity of life, the comforting predictability of her daily routines, a counterpoint to the extraordinary events she had navigated. She tended her garden with meticulous care, prepared her meals with the same understated precision she applied to her observations, and took time to write letters to friends in neighboring villages, describing with gentle humor the peculiarities of human behavior she had witnessed. Each correspondence, though seemingly innocuous, carried insights carefully woven into anecdotes and reflections, offering subtle lessons in perception to those who could discern them. Evenings were spent in the soft glow of lamplight, with the occasional company of Craddock or a neighbor seeking guidance or conversation. Discussions ranged from the mundane to the intricate, yet Miss Marple consistently drew connections between seemingly trivial remarks and the broader patterns of behavior she had long studied. The silver mask itself, now safely restored to its display, served as a quiet reminder of the fragility of appearances and the remarkable capacity of individuals to mask their intentions. It remained a symbol not merely of the incident, but of the enduring complexity and subtle drama that lay beneath the surface of village life. As autumn deepened, St. Mary Mead settled into its familiar cadence. Children played along the narrow lanes, merchants arranged their goods in cheerful displays, and neighbors exchanged greetings imbued with renewed warmth, tempered by the awareness that vigilance, observation, and empathy were as essential to the fabric of the community as kindness and decorum. Miss Marple, watching from her window, allowed herself a momentary reflection on the events that had unfolded. Human nature, she mused, was endlessly fascinating, its mysteries layered and intricate, yet always revealing themselves to the patient observer. With the case concluded, life in St. Mary Mead retained its outward tranquility, but beneath the surface, a subtle shift had occurred. The villagers were reminded, gently but unmistakably, that even in the most peaceful settings intrigue could surface, motivations could clash, and human behavior could confound expectations. And amid it all, Miss Marple, ever composed, continued to embody the quiet but inexorable power of perception, ensuring that the harmony of her village endured, informed by wisdom, patience, and the gentle but unerring insight of her observations. The first frost of late November had arrived in St. Mary Mead, and a delicate coating of white shimmered on the garden hedges as Miss Marple stepped out with her shawl wrapped snugly about her shoulders. The air carried a brisk chill, invigorating yet tempered by the faint warmth of a morning sun struggling to pierce the thin veil of mist that lingered across the village lanes. She moved slowly, enjoying the subtle crunch of frost beneath her sensible shoes, allowing her thoughts to meander over the events of the past weeks. Though the enigma of the silver mask had been resolved, she felt no rush to abandon her reflections, understanding that the heart of a mystery often lay not merely in the solution, but in observing the consequences it wrought upon human hearts and minds. From the vantage of her garden path, she could see the familiar shapes of the villagers going about their daily routines, now tinged with the consciousness that even the most ordinary individuals could harbor secrets or act in ways unexpected. Mrs. Cartwright, dressed in her customary soft hues, tended to the small flower beds outside her home, exchanging brief nods with neighbors who passed by. Their conversation now a little more measured and cautious, as if each word carried a subtle acknowledgment of the incident at Oakwood Manor. Lady Rowena, with her polished composure, could occasionally be glimpsed through the window of her drawing-room, arranging her objects with a precision that suggested both relief and lingering care, a quiet attempt to restore order in the wake of disorder. Miss Marple paused to watch a young boy scurry past, his laughter echoing faintly through the crisp, morning air. The simplicity of such moments, she thought, was both a comfort and a reminder life continued, and yet the intricate threads of human behavior that had allowed the silver mask's enigma to unfold would remain forever part of the village's tapestry. There was a peculiar satisfaction in knowing that the delicate balance between curiosity, deception, and trust had been restored, and that each individual involved had, in their own manner, absorbed lessons they might carry for years to come. Later that afternoon, she received a visit from Inspector Craddock, who arrived with his usual quiet efficiency. The inspector, ever courteous yet unassuming, took a seat in Miss Marple's modest sitting-room, his hands folded neatly across his knees. "Miss Marple," he began, his tone reflecting both formality and a personal warmth, "I trust that all is well with you. I felt it necessary to confirm that Oakwood Manor and the surrounding households are returning to their normal rhythms. The resolution you facilitated has been received with relief, though I dare say, as always, you observed far more than anyone could have anticipated." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her knitting basket. "Inspector, you give me too much credit. One only notices what people themselves reveal, sometimes without realizing it. The story of the Silver Mask was never truly about the object, but about the subtle interplay of character and circumstance, of pride and fear, of small resentments that gather unseen over the years. Her words, though spoken softly, carried a gravity that prompted Craddock to nod in thoughtful acknowledgement. The mutual understanding between them, a silent testament to the understated complexities of village life. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of Mrs. McGillicuddy, a neighbor whose fascination with local events often led her to seek out Miss Marple's company, especially in matters of intrigue. She entered briskly, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. "Miss Marple, and I simply must say, the whole affair has left me positively breathless. I could hardly imagine the boldness it took to carry off such a deception with that silver mask. And yet," she added, leaning in slightly, "it all seems so genteel in a peculiar sense, almost as though the village itself conspired to keep the secret alive until the right moment." Miss Marple chuckled faintly, offering a cup of tea with her usual calm demeanor. "Indeed, my dear, there is a rhythm to human behavior, patterns that emerge when one takes the time to observe. The village, like any community, thrives on routine and familiarity. When those are disrupted, even subtly, it reveals truths that might otherwise remain hidden for years. And so, while the mask is restored to its rightful place, the lessons gleaned from the incident linger, quietly influencing the interactions of all who were involved." The afternoon unfolded with a gentle, unhurried pace. Miss Marple and her visitors sipped tea, discussed minor village news, and allowed the warmth of the hearth to offset the crisp chill outside. Through these simple rituals, the detective reflected on the human tendencies that had guided the unfolding of the mystery, the assumptions made in haste, the courage to conceal motives, and the vulnerability that accompanies trust. Each observation reinforced her conviction that while objects and artifacts might capture attention, it is the human heart, in its quiet complexity, that holds the true key to understanding. As dusk approached, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and lavender, Miss Marple took a final walk through her garden. The silhouettes of bare branches and the faint shimmer of frost served as a poetic reminder that life's mysteries often exist in the spaces between certainty and conjecture. The silver mask, safely returned and admired from a respectful distance, symbolized not only the ingenuity of its temporary custodian, but also the enduring subtleties of observation, the importance of patience, and the quiet triumph of discernment over assumption. By the time evening fell over St. Mary Mead, the village had resumed its characteristic serenity. The lessons of Oakwood Manor, while no longer the subject of urgent discussion, had subtly influenced conversations, manners, and perspectives. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in her favorite chair by the fire, allowed herself a reflective smile. The world, she mused, contained an endless variety of human stories, each offering a small, vital glimpse into the intricacies of character, the subtle dance of deception and honesty, and the timeless truth that careful observation, tempered by understanding and empathy, remained the surest path to insight. And in that gentle, unassuming victory, the village's equilibrium was restored, quietly, elegantly, and wholly.